Hello, my name is Harry Jackson, and today we're going to be talking about J.J. McAlester and his strategic rise in prominence and influence in the Indian Territory and in the newly formed state of Oklahoma. Oh! More about that later! Whew, narrowly avoided that one. Now that we're safe, let me explain what just happened. There's a legend here about Rebecca McAlester. She was very supportive of her husband, and her husband made a lot of money. And so there's a cupola on the top of the house over there. And the legend is that she would sit in the cupola with her rifle when JJ was about to come home. And she would guard him on the way home. So that is the legend of Rebecca McAlester. Here we are in Krebs, Oklahoma, and here's an example of a lump of coal that J.J. McAlester loaded up in his wagon and took to Kansas to encourage the Missouri, Kansas, Texas railway engineers to route the railroad line through Buck-Luxley, where his general store was.
McAlester, of course, knew about the coal seams that were in the area because of a geologist's survey notebook that he had acquired from a friend when he was in Arkansas. And so he moved to this area on purpose, hired on as a freighter, and then became partners with a couple of established businessmen and freighters in the area, and purposely sought out the town or the site of the crossroads, which is now the northern part of McAlester, North McAlester. There was a mix among the Indian leaders. Some chiefs would come in, and they were known as the progressives, and they would say, yes, we need to do these things and develop our economy and make money off of these things. And then there were the stand-patters, as they were often called, or the pejorative was used as the buzzards. And the chief at the time, his name was Coleman Cole. Remember, a historian at one point said, that seems very fortuitous. Coleman Cole was against coal, but of course it's Coleman, C-O-L-E. And Coleman Cole was one of those buzzards, or one of those Indians who wanted to retain the traditions, who did not want the railroads to come. He did not want the coal mining to occur, and he wanted it to be peeled back wherever he could. And he was governor in the 1870s, or chief of the tribe in the 1870s, as he was trying to deal with this. And that's what got him and McAlester, J.J. McAlester, into loggerheads over this. Now, McAlester looked at the tribal records, looked at the laws that have been passed, and said, what I'm doing is exactly right. It's exactly right because I can claim up to 1 mile in radius of property and claim the natural resources there, the coal that might be there. And I can make partnerships, and those laws apply to that. But what Cole objected to was that he was in cahoots with the railroads. The MK&T was the biggest customer and ultimately began owning most of the coal mines and used that for their own purposes, for the railroad, for the engines and so forth, but also sold it in different markets around. And they and so Coleman Cole did not think that that should happen, that the railroads and outsiders should be involved. And in fact, he interpreted the law that this was a capital offense when you were selling the property of the Choctaw Nation to outsiders. And so he sent the light horsemen, or the police, the militia, to arrest McAlester. He was arrested and threatened with execution. He managed to escape in one of those railroad handcars with help from a couple of burly Irishmen who took him and 2 of his other partners out of harm's way, and came back and negotiated and made a deal where he would get part of the royalties and the government of the Choctaw Nation would get royalties. And of course, McAlester pointed out that they benefited significantly with millions and millions of dollars of royalty, the Choctaw Nation did, because of his efforts.
In 1893, J.J. McAlester finished the new brick store here in what is now known as McAlester. In the same year, Grover Cleveland appointed J.J. McAlester as U.S. Marshal for the entire Indian Territory, which stretches from Kansas to Texas, about 1/3 of what is now Oklahoma.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for the Freemasons here in Oklahoma.
Yes, my name is T.S. Akers, and since about 2014, I have been in the role as curator of Masonic collections at the McAlester Scottish Rite Valley. The Scottish Rite is a branch of Freemasonry that a man can join once he's become a Master Mason, and the Scottish Rite confers the 4th through the 33rd degrees. And then in my role there at the McAlester Scottish Rite Valley is I oversee our museum dedicated to the history of Freemasonry in the Indian Territory. And then I am also an officer of the Grand Commandery of Knights Templar of Oklahoma, which is part of the York Rite Freemasonry, another branch of Freemasonry that men can join.
I understand J.J. McAlester was an advocate for expanding Freemasonry in the Indian Territory. Would you explain what he did to expand the breadth of Freemasonry in Southeast Oklahoma?
So as the Katy Railway came through the Indian Territory in 1872, the 5 tribes were required to grant a right-of-way to the railway, and that right-of-way allowed for Euro-American settlement in the Indian Territory that previously wasn't possible. Now, J.J. McAlester was a white man, and he had married into the Choctaw Nation, and that granted him citizenship in the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations, which is how he was able to do business and establish himself in what became McAlester, and that actually allowed him to stake claims in the coal deposits in the area, which really set him on his way. With the railway coming through in 1872 and more men were coming into the Indian Territory, Freemasonry began to spread across the Indian Territory. And it was in 1877, in September of 1877, that McAlester Lodge number 9 was chartered by the Grand Lodge of the Indian Territory.
And here we're standing next to the Mason building that was built in 1906, according to the cornerstone. And this is a sign that was provided by the Union Pacific, of course, as they established some of the historic buildings here in downtown Old Town McAlester. We got some shots around the corner of the entryway into the building and various other accoutrements that are on the building. But this is just down the street from J.J. McAllister's store as well as his mansion. And we see here Mason symbols are actually built into the pavement. Imagine that this would have been the door going into the 2nd floor where the Mason Lodge was. This building was built in 1906. The original Mason Lodge number 9 was established in 1878.
So McAlester Lodge number 9 comes into existence, and JJ transfers his membership from Muskogee Lodge down to McAlester, which is where he's residing, so that makes more sense. And McAlester Lodge's composition early on, it was, I think in 1880 or so, they had about 35 members. So, that's about on par for what an average lodge during the Indian Territory had. And the interesting composition of McAlester Lodge is that the earlier Indian Territory lodges had primarily indigenous membership, but McAlester Lodge's membership was 71% white, so it was primarily a Euro-American lodge. So that's where you really start to see how the settlements is starting to shift and the culture is starting to shift with the Indian Territory as more Euro-Americans come in, and JJ's part of that. JJ became treasurer of McAlester Lodge number 9 pretty early on, and he seems to have held that role for a good period. And I would venture to say his business interests made him someone that they considered to be not only trustworthy, but someone who could also maintain accurate records of the lodge's expenses and their accounts.
We have a photo of J.J. McAlester in what appears to be a military uniform, sitting with another gentleman. Would you please explain what we are seeing in that photo?
Yes, so the photograph of JJ in uniform with another gentleman. The other gentleman is a fellow by the name of Frank Smith. And Frank Smith was the Grand Commander of Knights Templar of the Indian Territory in 1906. The Knights Templar are, these particular Knights Templar are a Masonic organization that wears military uniforms. The uniforms were adopted after the Civil War. And really, there was a lot of surplus uniforms around, and all of these makers that had been making uniforms, their thought is, what are we going to do with all of these extra uniforms we have? Well, you can dye them black and you can sell them to fraternal societies. And the Templars were one of those fraternal societies that they adopted a uniform. They wore fancy hats with feathers, and they carried swords, and they did intricate drills and marching. And when we say Masonic Knights Templar, this is not a Templar organization that has any connection to the ancient Templars, which are today popular and have always been popular. But the Masonic Knights Templar were born of Masonic degrees that were developed in German Masonic lodges during the 7 Years' War. And one of the allies in that particular conflict was the British. And the British adopted these Templar degrees into their regimental lodges. And it was through those regimental lodges that the Knights Templar degrees came to what would become the United States. Paul Revere was one of the first men to be created a Knight Templar in the Americas. And it was done in a British regimental lodge in Boston. So JJ is wearing his Templar uniform in that photograph. And the uniform it's a double-breasted coat, which indicates that JJ has served as commander of his Commandery of Knights Templar.
Now, he is one of the principal people in the development of the economy in Indian Territory, the eastern half of Oklahoma. And he was down in the Choctaw Nation at the place that is now called McAlester. I think rich, detailed stories about what happened, told in a way that tries to exact the truth as much as possible in an interesting way, will lead readers to decide what was going on there. And certainly, like all human beings, we're all flawed, and we do things that are not good. And that's part of the story. To leave it out is not the way you should go, but to only talk about that is not the way you should go. But in any case, that McAlester built a fortune and became a millionaire, what today would be a multimillionaire, and got into politics.
JJ was a businessman and eventually was the first in the first Corporation Commission Board of Oklahoma in 1907. Would you explain the positions that JJ held in Freemasonry prior to statehood that would have helped him execute his duties as one of the first Corporation Commissioners for the state of Oklahoma?
So the Corporation Commission, they were established to regulate public service corporations. And JJ had been in the coal industry, so he sort of had a background there. But probably what you're looking for as a corporation commissioner is someone who's trustworthy and reliable and can maintain accurate records and that sort of stuff. And JJ early on became treasurer of his local lodge, but he also went on to serve as treasurer of the Grand Lodge of the Indian Territory, beginning in 1878, and then he did again in 1889, and for about 10 years from that point forward. So he would have been responsible for keeping the accounts of the Grand Lodge. He also went on to do that for the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons. And JJ was a charter member of Indian Chapter number 1 of Royal Arch Masons there in McAlester. And the Grand Chapter was formed in 1890. So during that period, he would have been Grand Treasurer of the not only the Grand Lodge but the Grand Chapter, and then he was also Grand Treasurer of the Grand Commander of Knights Templar. So the Masons of the Indian Territory placed a lot of faith in JJ in not running off with the money, not absconding with the money, and keeping accurate accounts. So and you've got to consider, not just anybody could really do that role. To be honest with you, you had to have some level of education and understanding to be able to successfully manage those sorts of positions.
Can you provide any details about J.J. McAllister's role as a member of the first Corporation Commission for the state of Oklahoma?
Well, of course, that would be from 1907, late 1907, but mainly 1908, 1909, 1910. And then he ran for lieutenant governor in 1910 and served out the rest of his term in early 1911 as corporation commissioner. But as corporation commissioner, the commission oversaw a lot of different things, primarily the railroads, utilities, and oil and gas exploration. So oil and gas, utilities, and railroads. It was also the Railroad Commission combined with the other two functions.
J.J. McAlester sold his business to George Busby in 1904, but that doesn't mean that J.J.'s store went away. It actually maintained the same name. As we can see on the building behind us, the advertisement, it had gotten quite prosperous, and all kinds of various things, to include even automobiles. The building immediately behind us, the red brick building, was built in 1912, and the whiter building right beside it was built in 1911, the same year that J.J. McAlester became lieutenant governor, the second lieutenant governor of the state of Oklahoma.